John Carter, a 75-year-old Vietnam War veteran, his weathered face etched with a lifetime of silent sacrifice. Picture a lavish wedding at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, where crystal chandeliers gleam and champagne flows, celebrating his son Michael's rise to tech stardom. But beneath the glitz, a vicious rumor festers. John's tales of heroism are branded lies, his humble badge mocked as a fake, leaving him shunned at a corner table, humiliated before hundreds. The sting of betrayal cuts deep as his own son turns away, and a viral video spreads the scorn online. Will John's truth ever see the light, or will he leave in disgrace? Stay tuned as secret guests crash the night, turning shame into honor in a way you won't believe. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let's uncover this unforgettable story together. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan glittered under a cascade of crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where every detail screamed wealth and ambition. It was a wedding designed to impress with gold-trimmed invitations, a string quartet playing Vivaldi, and guests in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, clinking champagne flutes. But amidst the polished laughter and clattering silverware, a single moment sliced through the opulence like a knife. A man in a pinstriped suit, his face flushed from too much bourbon, stood up from his table and pointed across the room. "Hey, Carter. He bellowed his voice, cutting through the hum of celebration. "Why don't you tell us one of your war stories? Or are you just a liar, like they say, John Carter?" The 5-year-old father of the groom sat alone at a small table near the buffet tucked away in a corner where the light barely reached. His gray suit, pressed but faded, hung loosely on his wiry frame, and a small, unfamiliar badge pinned to his lapel glinted faintly. The room turned to look some smirking others whispering. John's weathered face remained calm, his blue eyes steady, but the accusation hung in the air heavy as smoke. He offered no defense, only a faint nod, as if the insult was just another gust of wind he'd weathered before. The crowd's attention lingered, their murmurs growing sharper. "He says he was some kind of hero in Vietnam," one guest muttered, rolling her eyes. "No medals, no proof. Probably just an old man spinning tales." But then, for a fleeting moment, the scene in John's mind shifted. He wasn't in the ballroom anymore. He was 25 again, sprinting through a jungle in Vietnam, the air thick with smoke and the crack of gunfire. His boots sank into the mud as he dragged a wounded soldier to safety, bullets whizzing past his head. The memory lasted only seconds, but it was vivid enough to tighten his grip on the tablecloth. Back in the present, the laughter around him grew louder, the guests oblivious to the truth buried in his silence. John adjusted his tie, his hands steady despite the weight of their scorn. He hadn't come to this wedding to prove anything. He was here for his son. Michael the groom, whose polished smile and tech empire success were the talk of the night. The contrast was stark. The ballroom pulsed with privilege, CEOs swapping business cards, influencers snapping selfies, and a towering wedding cake that cost more than John's old pickup truck. Yet John, with his quiet dignity, seemed out of place, a relic from another time. His table was a forgotten outpost, shared with a bored caterer and an elderly aunt who kept misplacing her napkin. No one approached him to chat. No one asked about the badge on his chest. Instead, they mocked it, their whispers carrying across the room. "What's that thing on his jacket?" A young woman in a sequined dress sneered. "Looks like something you'd buy at a flea market." Another guest chuckled, adding, "If he was such a big deal, why's he sitting by the shrimp cocktail?" John's solitude was more than physical. It was a deliberate erasure, a sign of how the world had moved on without him. The wedding was a showcase of new money and new dreams, and John, with his worn-out stories and unverified past, didn't fit the narrative. Yet there was something in his posture, shoulders squared, head slightly tilted that hinted at a strength the guests couldn't see. He sipped his water, his gaze drifting to the head table where Michael stood radiant in a custom tuxedo, toasting with his bride, Emily. Michael hadn't glanced at his father once, not during the ceremony, not during the speeches. It stung, but John's face betrayed no pain. He'd learned long ago to bury hurt deep where it couldn't touch him. The accusation of being a liar wasn't new. For years, John had heard the doubts, the snickers, the questions about why a supposed war hero lived so modestly with no framed medals on his wall, no parade in his honor. He never corrected them, never pulled out the one piece of evidence he kept hidden. To him, the truth didn't need a spotlight. But tonight, the insult felt sharper, amplified by the glittering crowd and the weight of his son's indifference. The man who'd called him a liar returned to his seat, basking in the laughter he'd provoked, unaware that he'd just ignited a spark in a story far bigger than himself. As the band struck up a new song, the guests turned back to their conversations, dismissing John as a footnote in their evening of grandeur. But John's eyes held a flicker of something else, resolve, perhaps, or the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced worse than mockery and come out standing. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against a small envelope, its edges worn from years of handling. It was addressed to Michael, written in John's careful handwriting. He hadn't planned to give it to him tonight. Not like this, but the weight of the moment pressed on him. The envelope was a promise, a piece of his past he'd kept locked away. For now, he left it in his pocket, his hand resting there as if to anchor himself. The wedding rolled on a whirlwind of clinking glasses and practiced smiles, but the air around John felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. The guests might have forgotten him, their attention shifting to the next toast, the next dance. But the truth, like a storm, gathering on the horizon, was closer than they knew. John's story wasn't over. It was just beginning to unfold, and the room was about to learn that some heroes don't need a stage to shine. The laughter faded, but the whispers about John's past grew sharper, like knives honed in the dark, as the crowd mocked his badge and his silence. They were blind to the secret it held, a truth waiting to surface. The whispers slithered through the Plaza Hotel's ballroom, sharp and venomous, weaving a web of doubt around John Carter's quiet presence. The accusation of being a liar hurled moments ago had lit a fuse, and now the guests fanned the flames with their hushed gossip. At a table draped in ivory linen, a woman in a sapphire gown leaned toward her companion, her voice low but cutting. "He claims he was some kind of soldier in Vietnam, but where's the proof? No discharge papers, no shiny medals, just an old man with a story." Her friend smirked, swirling his wine. Probably spent the war pushing pencils if he was even there. The words drifted across the room, mingling with the clink of silverware and the band's soft jazz, each syllable a jab at John's dignity. John sat at his corner table, the dim light casting shadows across his lined face. His hands rested on the table, one still clutching the glass of water he hadn't sipped in minutes. To the casual observer, he was unmoved, his expression as steady as stone. But the faintest tremor in his fingers betrayed a storm brewing beneath the surface. He'd heard the rumors before, decades of them, in fact, but tonight they carried a sharper sting, amplified by the grandeur of his son's wedding and the weight of being dismissed in front of hundreds. The badge on his lapel, small and unassuming, seemed to burn against his chest, a silent testament to truths the crowd was too quick to mock. The tension spiked when a man staggered toward John's table, his tie loosened and his cheeks ruddy from liquor. It was Tom Grayson, a distant cousin of the bride. Known for his loud opinions and louder laugh, he planted his hands on the table, leaning in close enough for John to smell the whiskey on his breath. "Come on, Mr. Carter." Tom slurred his voice, carrying to nearby tables. "You keep saying you were some big-shot soldier. Tell us a real story. Something with blood and guts. Or is it all just hot air? The words were a challenge, a dare wrapped in mockery, and the guests around them turned to watch, their eyes glinting with amusement. A ripple of chuckles spread, emboldening Tom to press further. What nothing to say. Guess that proves it? Then John's gaze met Tom's, calm, but piercing like a blade, held steady. He offered a thin smile, the kind that could mean anything or nothing at all. Some stories aren't meant for telling, he said softly, his voice low but firm. The response only fueled the laughter. Tom threw up his hands, turning to the crowd, like a performer milking applause. "See all talk, no proof," he crowed, stumbling back to his seat. But John's smile faded, and his hand tightened around the glass, the knuckles whitening. Inside, a quiet fury churned not at Tom, but at the ease with which the world dismissed what it couldn't see. He'd spent a lifetime swallowing that anger, burying it deep, but tonight it clawed at the edges of his restraint. Across the room, a younger guest barely out of college pulled out his phone and started recording. The camera caught John's solitary figure, the mocking laughter, and Tom's theatrics. Within seconds, the video was uploaded to Instagram, captioned with a sneering "old guy at the wedding thinks he's a war hero." Total fraud. The post spread like wildfire, racking up likes and comments from strangers who'd never met John, but were eager to pile on. "Bet he bought that badge online." One comment read, "Pathetic," said another. The digital venom mirrored the room's disdain, a modern echo of the same old judgment John had faced for years. Yet John didn't flinch. He set the glass down, his movements deliberate, and adjusted the badge on his lapel as if to remind himself of its weight. The crowd might see a frail old man, a nobody, in a cheap suit. But the badge told a different story, one they weren't ready to hear. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a fragment of a life spent in shadows, a life of sacrifice that didn't come with press releases or parades. The guests, with their polished lives and quick judgments, couldn't fathom the cost of what John had done, nor the reasons he'd kept it hidden. Their laughter was a symptom of a deeper flaw, a society that valued flash over substance, trophies over truth. As the band transitioned to a livelier tune, the guests returned to their conversations, their mockery of John fading into the background noise of clinking glasses and small talk. But the wound lingered, invisible but raw. John's eyes drifted to the head table, where Michael, his son, stood, laughing with his new wife, Emily. Michael hadn't heard the confrontation, or if he had, he'd chosen to ignore it. The distance between father and son felt wider than the ballroom itself, a chasm built on years of misunderstanding. John's fingers brushed the envelope in his pocket, the one he'd carried for Michael. He wasn't sure if he'd give it to him tonight. Not after this, but the thought of it steadied him, a lifeline to a purpose beyond the crowd's scorn. The air in the ballroom felt heavier, now charged with the weight of unspoken truths. The guests might have moved on, their attention caught by the next toast or the promise of dessert, but John's silence was a gathering storm. The badge on his chest, unnoticed by all, was more than a decoration. It was a key to a past that could unravel every assumption in the room. And as the night wore on, that past was inching closer to the surface, ready to demand its due. The laughter subsided, but the badge on John's lapel, a mystery no one bothered to unravel, glowed faintly in the dim light. Its secrets were a bridge to a truth the crowd couldn't imagine waiting to be revealed. "Thank you for your patience and for pointing out the issue with the transition sentence." Below is the corrected version of Part 3, with the final paragraph revised to include the exact transition sentence from the Dan I. Despite bearing the weight of a heroic past, John was little more than a shadow to Michael, a faded figure overshadowed by ambition and misunderstanding, setting the stage for a deeper familial rift that would soon come to light. The content remains unchanged, except for the final paragraph, to ensure the transition aligns perfectly with the Dan-E, maintaining the 1,000-word count. English TTS-friendly style, emotional delivery. Varied language and logical flow without repetition or motifs. I've cross-checked to ensure coherence with Parts 1 and 2 and alignment with the upcoming Part 4's focus on familial conflict. Part 3. Unveiling the Past, a Hero in the Shadows. The ballroom's chatter hummed on a relentless tide of clinking glasses and shallow pleasantries. But for John Carter, the world had narrowed to the small, tarnished badge pinned to his chest. The guests at the Plaza Hotel wedding with their tailored suits and diamond-studded wrists saw only an old man in a faded suit, a nobody whose quiet demeanor invited scorn. They didn't know, couldn't know that the badge was a relic of a life forged in fire, a life that had shaped history in ways no one in this room could fathom. John's fingers brushed the metal, its edges worn smooth by years of silent reverence, and for a moment he was no longer at the wedding. He was back in the jungles of Vietnam, where the air smelled of gunpowder and fear, and every step could be his last. Decades ago, John had been no ordinary soldier. He was the leader of a covert special forces unit known only by the code name Nighthawk. His mission in 1969, dubbed Shadow Strike, was a desperate gamble to rescue 50 American prisoners from a heavily guarded enemy camp deep in the Mekong Delta. The operation was so sensitive that even top brass were kept in the dark, its details buried under layers of classified seals. John had led his team through a night of chaos, crawling through mud, dodging tripwires, silencing sentries, with nothing but a knife and steady hands. Against all odds, they'd freed every prisoner without a single casualty, slipping back into the jungle like ghosts. The mission was a triumph, but its secrecy meant no parades, no headlines, only a handshake from a colonel who whispered, "You were never here." The badge John wore tonight was the only public trace of that night, reissued just months ago, after a rare declassification of partial records. It wasn't a medal, not officially, but a discreet emblem given to those who'd served in operations too dangerous to acknowledge. John had accepted it quietly, declining an invitation to a private ceremony in Washington. He'd told the officer, "I did my job. That's enough." The badge was his private vow, a reminder of the men he'd saved and the ones he'd lost along the way. He kept it hidden most days, locked in a wooden box under his bed, alongside a faded photograph of his unit grim-faced men who'd trusted him with their lives. That box was his sanctuary, a place to honor what the world had forgotten. Back in the ballroom, the guests were oblivious to the weight of John's past. They saw the badge and laughed, calling it a trinket, a prop for an old man's delusions. Their ignorance was a kind of cruelty, a dismissal of sacrifices they'd never understand. John's eyes traced the room, landing on the head table, where his son Michael stood, his laughter ringing out as he toasted with his bride. Michael had never asked about the badge, never pressed for details about his father's time in Vietnam. To him, John's stories were just that, stories. Embellishments from a man who'd returned from war with nothing to show but a modest house and a mechanic's job. The truth was too heavy, too raw, and John had chosen silence over burdening his son with it. That silence had cost him. Over the years, John had watched the world move on, honoring louder men with flashier tales. He'd seen veterans parade their medals on TV, their heroics polished for the cameras, while men like him, men who'd worked in the shadows, were left to fade. He didn't resent them. He envied their freedom to speak. His own vows, made to protect the secrecy of his missions, had bound him to a life of quiet endurance. The declassification had loosened those chains, but only slightly. Even now, with the badge on his chest, he couldn't tell the full story, not without risking the safety of others who'd been part of Shadow Strike. So he wore the badge and let the world judge him, knowing the truth was worth more than their approval. The ballroom's lights seemed to dim as John's thoughts lingered on that wooden box at home. He could picture it clearly. The photograph, the folded flag from a fallen friend, the single letter he'd written to his wife during the war, promising he'd come back. She'd been his anchor, the reason he'd survived. But she was gone now, and the box was all he had left of her, too. The guests around him, with their careless laughter, couldn't imagine such a life. They measured worth in stock portfolios and social media followers, not in promises kept or lives saved. Their world was one of surfaces, and John, with his weathered hands and unspoken truths, didn't belong in it. Yet belonging wasn't why John was here. He'd come for Michael to see his boy now, a man step into a new chapter. The pain of being ignored, of hearing his past mocked, was secondary to that purpose. He'd endured worse than whispers and drunken taunts. He'd faced death and walked away. But tonight, the weight of the badge felt heavier, as if it were pulling him toward a reckoning. He shifted in his seat, his gaze settling on the envelope in his pocket. It was more than a letter. It was a piece of his soul meant for Michael. When the time was right, whether that time would come tonight, John didn't know. For now he waited his silence, a shield and a sword. Despite bearing the weight of a heroic past, John was little more than a shadow to Michael, a faded figure overshadowed by ambition and misunderstanding, setting the stage for a deeper familial rift that would soon come to light. The Plaza Hotel ballroom shimmered with the kind of elegance that made headlines, its chandeliers casting a golden haze over tables laden with orchids and crystal. At the heart of it all stood Michael Carter, the groom, a vision of success in his tailored tuxedo, his tech empire charisma drawing every eye. He raised a champagne flute, his voice smooth as he thanked the crowd for joining him and his bride Emily in their moment of triumph. The guests clapped their applause, a testament to Michael's rise from humble roots to Silicon Valley stardom. But beneath the polished surface of his smile, a quiet unease gnawed at him, a shadow cast by the man he'd spent years trying to erase his father, John Carter, whose presence at this wedding felt like a crack in his carefully curated world. Michael had built his life on ambition, each step a deliberate move to outrun the small, weathered house where he'd grown up. His father's stories of Vietnam, fragmented tales of courage and loss, had once been background noise like static on an old radio. But as Michael grew older, those stories became a source of discomfort, a reminder of a life too modest for his dreams. He remembered a fight when he was 16, the summer heat thick in their cramped living room. John had mentioned a mission. Something about saving lives, and Michael, fueled by teenage defiance, had lashed out. "You're always going on about the war, Dad, but what's it worth? You've got nothing to show for it. No money, no name, nothing." John's face had tightened, his eyes, holding a pain Michael didn't understand. He'd walked away without a word, leaving Michael with a guilt he'd never shaken. Now at 35, Michael was a man who thrived in boardrooms and magazine profiles, his name synonymous with innovation. Inviting John to the wedding had been an obligation, a nod to family ties he'd rather keep out of sight. He'd given strict instructions to the planner seat his father at a peripheral table, away from the tech moguls and venture capitalists who filled the guest list. No speech, no role in the ceremony. Michael couldn't afford the risk of John spinning unverified tales in front of people whose respect he'd fought to earn. The thought of his father with his faded suit and cryptic badge standing before this crowd made Michael's chest tighten. He stole a glance at John's table, where the old man sat alone, his posture rigid but unassuming. For a moment their eyes met, and Michael looked away, his jaw clenching with a mix of dread and shame. That shame had roots deeper than Michael cared to admit. In college, he'd started reshaping his story, telling classmates his father was retired. A vague term that hid John's reality as a mechanic who fixed cars for a living. The lies grew over time, small at first, then bolder, until John became a footnote in Michael's narrative. A man whose existence didn't match the glossy image of success Michael had justified it to himself. His world demanded perfection, and John, with his quiet ways and unverifiable past, was a liability. But each lie widened the gulf between them, turning his father into a stranger. Deep down, Michael feared the truth that John's stories might be real, that the man he'd dismissed as a failure was someone extraordinary. That fear was a weight he carried heavier than the gold band on his finger. The ballroom's energy seemed to dim as Michael's thoughts spiraled. He remembered a childhood moment, a rare Saturday when John had taken him to a dusty hardware store, the kind where old men swapped stories over coffee. John had bought a wrench, chatting with the cashier about a friend he'd lost in Vietnam. Michael, barely 12, had fidgeted, embarrassed by his father's somber tone, wishing they could leave. Now that memory stung a missed chance to listen, to connect. He'd been too young to care, too eager to chase a future that left no room for his father's past. But tonight, with John sitting just across the room, that past felt closer, more insistent, like a pulse he couldn't ignore. The wedding pressed on a dazzling spectacle of music and merriment. Emily's laughter pulled Michael back to the moment, her hand warm in his, and he forced a smile, joining the chorus of toasts and cheers. But the sight of John isolated at his table lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. Michael hadn't heard the earlier jeers, the cousins' drunken taunts, or seen the Instagram post that mocked his father's honor. Yet he felt the strain, the invisible thread tying him to a man he'd spent years pushing away. John wasn't just a bystander. He was a mirror reflecting truths Michael wasn't ready to face. As the band launched into a lively tune, the crowd spilled onto the dance floor, their voices blending into a joyful roar. Michael moved with them, his arm around Emily, but his heart wasn't in it. His father's presence was a quiet disruption, a reminder of choices he'd made and questions he'd avoided. He didn't know about the envelope. John carried a secret gift tucked in his pocket, or the badge's hidden meaning. But he sensed a shift, a tension building beneath the surface of this perfect night. The distance between him and John was more than physical. It was a chasm of his own, making one that would soon demand to be crossed. As the wedding ceremony swirls around him, Michael remains unaware of the hidden gift John carries, a symbol of his father's love and a truth that is about to change everything. The Plaza Hotel ballroom glowed with an almost otherworldly splendor, its marble floors reflecting the flicker of candlelight and the swirl of designer gowns. Laughter and music wove a tapestry of celebration, each note from the string quartet a reminder of the night's grandeur. At the center of it all, the newlyweds Michael and Emily shone like stars, their every move, watched by a crowd eager to bask in their success. But in a forgotten corner, John Carter sat, a solitary figure whose presence seemed to fade with every passing moment. The wedding, meticulously planned to project wealth and prestige, had no place for a man whose worth couldn't be measured in dollars or headlines. Tonight, John wasn't just overlooked, he was erased, his existence scrubbed from the narrative of his son's triumph. The first cut came during the video montage, a glossy reel projected on a massive screen above the head table. It traced Michael's life from childhood to this glittering moment, a toddler's first steps, a high school graduation, a corner office with a city view. The guests cooed and clapped, but John's heart sank as the frames flickered by. Not a single image included him, no fishing trips, No quiet evenings fixing the car together, no trace of the man who'd raised Michael. The omission was deliberate, a silent declaration that John didn't belong in this story. He stared at the screen, his face unreadable, but his fingers tightened around the napkin in his lap, a small anchor against the tide of exclusion. The second blow landed during the speeches. Emily's father, a Wall Street titan named Richard Langley, took the stage, his voice booming with pride as he toasted the couple's future. He spoke of family legacy and love, but John's name never crossed his lips. The crowd hung on every word, their applause thunderous, while John sat motionless, his gaze fixed on a distant point. When the MC announced the father-son dance, Michael stepped forward, not with John, but with Richard, who'd flown in from a yacht in the Hamptons to play the part. The two moved across the floor, Richard's hand on Michael's shoulder, a picture of familial pride that left John as a spectator in his own son's life. The guests cheered, unaware of the man whose absence spoke louder than their ovation. The final indignity was crueler, more personal. As John reached for his water glass, a guest, a young hedge fund manager named Ethan, already unsteady, from too many cocktails, stumbled past. His elbow knocked a glass of red wine, sending a crimson splash across John's vest. The liquid seeped into the fabric, a stark stain on the faded gray. Ethan burst into laughter, his voice carrying over the music. "Whoops, guess you'll need a new suit now, Pops," he crowed, not bothering to apologize. The tables nearby joined in their chuckles, a chorus of indifference. John's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, pulling a napkin from the table to blot the stain. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each swipe was a way to reclaim his dignity from the careless cruelty of the moment. Michael, standing near the head table, saw it all. He caught the glint of wine on his father's vest, heard the laughter that followed, and felt a pang of something, guilt perhaps, or shame. But he turned away his eyes, locking onto Emily's smile instead. He told himself it was nothing, that John could handle it, that this wasn't the time to make a scene. Yet the choice to do nothing weighed on him, a silent betrayal that deepened the rift he'd already carved. John, meanwhile, finished wiping his vest, the napkin now streaked with red. He set it down, his hands steady despite the humiliation, and reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around a small envelope, its surface worn from years of handling, addressed to Michael in his careful script. It was a gift, a piece of his heart meant for his son, but the laughter still echoing in his ears made him hesitate. John rose from his chair, his movements quiet but resolute. He'd come to celebrate Michael, to see his boy step into a new life, but the night had made it clear he was not wanted here. The video, the speeches, the dance, the wine. They were more than oversights. They were a deliberate rejection of his place in this world. He adjusted his tie, the stained vest a badge of a different kind, and took a step toward the exit. The crowd didn't notice, their attention fixed on the dance floor where Michael and Emily swayed under a spotlight. John's heart ached not for himself, but for the son who'd chosen to write him out of this moment. He'd endured worse than mockery, worse than exclusion, but this cut deeper, a wound inflicted by the one he loved most. The ballroom's opulence stood in stark contrast to John's quiet departure. The guests, with their glittering lives, saw only what shone on the surface: wealth, status, success. They valued what could be displayed, not what was carried in silence. John's life, built on sacrifice and unspoken vows, was invisible to them, a story they'd never bothered to read. The envelope in his pocket was his last attempt to bridge that gap, to give Michael something real in a world obsessed with appearances. But as he neared the door, his steps heavy with the weight of rejection, he wondered if his son would ever care to open it. The music swelled the crowd's laughter, rising like a wave. But John kept walking, his silhouette fading into the shadows of the hallway. He was ready to leave this night behind, to carry his truth back to the quiet life he'd always known. But just as his hand touched the door, a sound pierced the air. A low, unmistakable roar that didn't belong in this world of champagne and chandeliers. It was a sound that stopped John in his tracks, a sound that would change everything. A deafening roar shattered the wedding's clamor, a raw pulse that drowned out laughter and music with the ferocity of spinning blades. John Carter, hand on the ballroom door, poised to slip into the night, froze as the sound of a military helicopter pierced the air. Its thunderous echo jolted the guests, their toasts halted eyes darting to the windows, where a Blackhawk descended onto the lawn, its dark form a specter against the starlit sky. The vibration shook the floor, a harbinger of a truth that would upend the night, stopping John in his tracks as his stained vest and heavy heart were momentarily forgotten. The venue's grand doors burst open, a sharp gust of night air sweeping through, silencing the crowd. 5 veterans strode in their dress uniforms, sharp metals gleaming like embers in the soft light. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel James Evans, his face carved with resolve, a scar above his brow, a mark of battles fought beside John long ago. In his hands rested a mahogany box, its glass lid framing a lone medal, while a worn cassette tape, its label faded, lay tucked under his arm, a piece of history ready to speak. The 4 veterans behind him marched in unison, their boots striking the marble with a rhythm that demanded reverence, their mission clear. The guests stood rooted, their revelry replaced by a stunned hush. Phones flickered on, capturing the resolute advance, but no voice dared break the tension. Michael, beside Emily at the head table, felt his smile waver, his gaze fixed on the figures with unease. John by the door caught his breath as he recognized Evans, a brother from a Saigon safe house, united by unspoken oaths. Hours earlier, a viral video of John's humiliation, mocked as a fraud at this very wedding, had reached Evans, who, outraged, rallied his comrades to restore their friend's honor. The bond of their past held John fast, his hand falling from the door as their arrival reshaped the night. Evans's presence was a force, his uniform's silver eagle, a testament to a life of sacrifice. The box and tape were not mere relics. They were keys to a legacy long buried, poised to redefine the moment. The veterans' march was a silent rebuke to the crowd's earlier scorn, their unity a contrast to the room's shallow alliances. They spared no glance for the onlookers, their eyes on John Carter, the man they'd come to champion. The air crackled with expectation, each step a drumbeat of impending change. Emily's hand tightened on Michael's, her eyes flicking to John, sensing a tide turning beyond her reach. As the veterans reached the dance floor's center, they halted, their formation precise. In one swift motion, they raised their right hands in a crisp salute, their eyes locked on John. The gesture was a blaze of respect, a military honor that sliced through the wedding's pretense, leaving the crowd breathless. Evans lowered his hand, his voice a resonant call across the silence. "John Carter, join us." The words were a summons forged in brotherhood, a plea from men who'd faced death together. John hesitated, his fingers clutching the envelope in his pocket, his urge to fade warring with their call. With a quiet nod, he stepped forward, his stained vest a symbol of resilience, crossing the floor as the crowd watched spellbound. The Blackhawk's rumble lingered outside, a steady pulse beneath the rising drama. The wedding's gloss had shattered its narrative, overtaken by a force no one could deny or no longer. A shadow at the door stood at the heart of a reckoning, the veteran's salute and Evans's call sparked by a viral video of his disgrace, a testament to his worth. Their arrival heralded a truth that would shake the room, drawing every gaze to the man they'd come to honor. The Plaza Hotel's grand hall stood cloaked in a solemn hush, its opulence fading before a truth that commanded reverence. 5 veterans, their uniforms a testament to sacrifice. Flanked John Carter, whose quiet presence now anchored the room, Lieutenant Colonel James Evans stepped forward, microphone in hand, his scarred face radiating resolve. His voice, deep and unyielding, cut through the silence. "We're here to honor John Carter," he declared, "and to right the wrongs of those who doubted him." As Nighthawk, he led a mission that saved 50 lives and reshaped history. Evans's words struck like a gavel, shattering the crowd's earlier contempt. He spoke of Shadow Strike, a 1969 operation in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, where John orchestrated the rescue of 50 prisoners from an enemy stronghold. His strategy, bold yet meticulous, ensured no lives were lost, a triumph hidden by classified orders. The badge on John's chest, once ridiculed, was a rare honor for such silent valor, now gleaming with newfound respect. The guests, their faces taut, leaned in, gripped by a reality that humbled their assumptions, their earlier jeers, a distant echo. Evans raised a faded cassette tape, its worn case a portal to the past. He slotted it into a player held by a comrade, and a general's voice from 1970 crackled through the air, stern and authoritative. Captain John Carter's leadership in Shadow Strike was unparalleled. It announced security protocols mandated his commendations remain undisclosed. The recording was a historical anchor, its stark truth erasing all doubt. The metal framed in its mahogany box caught the chandelier's glow, a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. The crowd, once eager to dismiss, now sat transfixed, their world view upended. The revelation hit with raw force. Ethan, the hedge fund manager who'd mocked John with spilled wine, stood rigid, his eyes widened, a flush of shame creeping up his neck. His trembling hand lost its grip on a Merlot glass, which shattered on the marble wine, spraying like a confession of guilt. The crash sliced the silence, a vivid mirror to his earlier cruelty, and he slumped into his seat, unable to look at John. The guests stirred, their gazes shifting from scorn to admiration, their laughter replaced by a chastened stillness that spoke louder than applause. The room transformed its grandeur, no match for the man at its heart. Men in fine suits, women in jeweled gowns, they saw John anew, his stained vest, a mark of resilience, not insignificance. The influencers who'd broadcast his disgrace now paused, their screens dark, their mockery undone. The grand hall, once a shrine to vanity, felt subdued, its extravagance eclipsed by a man who'd borne its disdain with grace. Evans' voice grew quieter, his eyes on John. His silence was his sacrifice, he said. "We speak now to restore what was taken." The words were a redemption, exposing the crowd's haste to judge they'd prized flash wealth status spectacle, while scorning what endured courage duty. A life of service, John's steadfast dignity unshaken by their cruelty, was a call to see beyond appearances. The veterans resolute beside him embodied a brotherhood that valued truth over acclaim. John stood calm, his hand on the envelope in his pocket, his face a shield of quiet strength, bearing the moment without seeking its glory. The cassette's final static dissolved, leaving a silence heavy with meaning. The medal's light, the veterans' unity, the glass shards on the floor all marked a turning point that redefined the night. John, the focal point of a truth laid bare, stirred a storm of emotions in Michael, poised to break through in a reckoning of his own. The grand hall stood hushed, its gilded splendor dimmed by a truth that reshaped its heart. The veteran's revelation had cast John Carter as a hero, his quiet strength now the room's center. Michael Carter! The groom gripped his chair, his polished facade crumbling under the weight of his father's unspoken sacrifices. His chest tightened, each breath a struggle against the realization of years spent blind to the man who stood among warriors. Emily's touch on his arm went unnoticed. His eyes locked on John, a figure both familiar and foreign unveiled in a light Michael had never sought. With trembling steps, Michael crossed the silent room, the crowd parting like a sea, their gazes soft with anticipation. Reaching John, his voice cracked raw with pain. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" The words were a wound, a plea for understanding for a bond lost to pride. John met his son's gaze, his eyes warm with a love that had endured decades of silence. "I wanted you to live free." "Michael," he said, his tone steady. Unburdened by my past, John's mind drifted to a rain-soaked morning in 1970, standing before a comrade's grave in a Saigon cemetery. The headstone, simple and stark, bore the name of a man lost in shadow strike. John's voice trembled as he vowed to shield their families from the mission's pain, a promise that bound him to secrecy. That oath made in grief had shaped his life, a gift of freedom for Michael, even at the cost of his own story. The memory lingered its weight, a silent testament to his choice. Michael's breath caught tears tracing his cheeks as the truth pierced him. He'd chased wealth and acclaim, dismissing John as a failure, his teenage scorn and calculated distance now ashes of regret. "I didn't know," he whispered, head bowed, the words a confession to the years he'd squandered. His hand reached for John's, a tentative grasp seeking forgiveness, a bridge across a chasm of misunderstanding. The crowd watched their silence, a canvas for a moment of raw redemption, their earlier judgments fading. John's hand clasped Michael's firm, yet gentle, a father's touch, offering solace without demand. He sought no apologies, only his son's peace, a life unshadowed by the wars he'd fought. The veterans stood as guardians, their presence, a quiet affirmation of John's worth, their bond, a contrast to Michael's past neglect. Emily at the head table brushed tears from her cheeks, moved by the unspoken love before her. The room's extravagance seemed to recede its gloss. No match for the connection forged in truth. Michael's tears were for more than his father's valor. They mourned a bond he'd failed to nurture, a man whose love had been his foundation. Guests exchanged glances, their skepticism melting into quiet respect stirred by the sight of a son's awakening. The truth was a wound, and a salve offering a chance to mend what was broken. John's words echoed in Michael's soul, a reminder that his freedom was a gift, bought with a silence heavier than any metal. The moment held them delicate and profound, a testament to love's power to heal the grand hall. Bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, seemed to hold its breath, the weight of truth settling like a quiet tide. John Carter stood among the veterans, his weathered frame a pillar of resilience, the echo of their words still rippling through the air. Michael's tear-streaked face, now lifted to meet his father's gaze, marked a private reconciliation, but the room's attention began to shift. The guests, once cloaked in smug certainty, stirred in their seats, their earlier mirth replaced by a dawning awareness. The man they'd dismissed as a relic, mocked as a fraud, stood revealed as a hero, and the realization demanded a response, a reckoning with their own missteps. One by one they rose. A woman in a sapphire gown, who'd whispered doubts over her wine, stood first, her head bowed in silent apology. Beside her, a man in a tailored suit followed, his eyes fixed on the floor, the smirk he'd worn hours ago. Gone. The ripple-spread tables emptying as guests stood, their silence a fragile offering of remorse. Those who'd laughed loudest at John's expense now moved with the heaviest steps, their faces etched with shame. The act was wordless, a collective gesture that spoke louder than any speech, a confession of their haste to judge what they hadn't understood. Among them, a young man in a crisp blazer stood out. He was Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, a Marine veteran who'd come as a +1, his presence unnoticed until now. His eyes locked on John, and with a steady hand he raised a salute, sharp and reverent, a soldier's tribute to a brother in arms. The gesture was a spark igniting others. A retired Navy officer at a nearby table mirrored the salute, then a former Army medic, their hands rising in unison. The act transcended rank or service guests with no military ties joined in their salutes, clumsy but earnest. A wave of honor that swept through the room. Dozens stood hands raised, a sea of respect that transformed the hall into a sanctuary of recognition. The moment was a mirror reflecting the crowd's earlier flaws. They'd been quick to scorn, seduced by appearances valuing wealth and wit over substance. John's quiet endurance, his refusal to bend under their taunts, exposed their shallowness. The truth laid bare by the men who'd fought beside him was a force they couldn't ignore, a call to shed their prejudices and see the man they'd wronged. The hall, once a stage for vanity, now bore witness to a humbling its extravagance, overshadowed by the power of integrity, unveiled. Across the room, a subtle shift unfolded online. The Instagram post that had branded John a fraud, uploaded with a sneer in the night's early hours, was gone, deleted by the young guest who'd filmed it. In its place, a new post appeared, raw and unpolished, a photo of John standing with the veterans, captioned, "I was wrong. This man is a hero." The words spread swiftly, shared thousands of times, each repost a thread in a digital tapestry of amends. Comments poured in, strangers and friends alike, offering apologies, their voices amplifying the truth that had reshaped the night. The platform that had fueled his humiliation now carried his vindication, a modern echo of the room's transformation. John remained still, his hand resting lightly on the envelope in his pocket, his face a mask of quiet resolve. He hadn't sought this moment, hadn't craved the crowd's acclaim, yet he bore it with the same dignity that had carried him through decades of silence. The veterans beside him stood unwavering, their presence, a shield, their bond, a reminder that true honor needed no applause. Michael, still close, watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and regret, the weight of his father's legacy, now a part of him. The salutes continued, a silent symphony of respect that filled the space with meaning. A woman in a sequined dress, who'd rolled her eyes at John's badge, now stood with her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly. A tech mogul, once quick to jest, joined the salute, his gesture hesitant but sincere. The act was a bridge connecting strangers through a shared acknowledgement of truth. The crowd's earlier division between those who mocked and those who ignored dissolved, replaced by a unity forged in humility. The hall's atmosphere had shifted, its air no longer thick with pretense, but alive with a quiet reverence. The guests, their phones now stilled, were no longer spectators but participants in a moment of redemption. They'd been taught a lesson not by words, but by the steadfast presence of a man who'd lived his truth without fanfare. The night, once defined by its gloss, now belonged to John, its meaning reshaped by the strength of sincerity. As the salutes began to lower, the silence held a sacred pause that honored the man at its center. The crowd's transformation was a testament to the power of truth, a force that had dismantled their biases and demanded they look deeper. John, standing tall, was no longer the forgotten figure of the night's start, but a beacon of what endured beyond the fleeting. The room's newfound respect was a foundation poised to build toward a collective act of honor that would echo beyond its walls. The wedding hall, its golden light softened by a newfound reverence, stood as a quiet witness to a moment of transformation. John Carter, flanked by the steadfast veterans, held the room's gaze, his presence a beacon of resilience. The crowd's salutes had faded, their bowed heads, now lifted eyes fixed on the man they'd once overlooked, Michael standing nearby. His face, still damp with tears, weighted the air thick with anticipation. John stepped forward, his stained vest a mark of battles both past and present, and took the microphone from Colonel Evans. His hands, weathered by years of toil, held it steady, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, a gentle current that carried the weight of a lifetime. "I didn't come here for medals," John began, his words clear, deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "I came for my son to see him start a new life. That's all." He paused, letting the simplicity of his purpose settle. Society lifts up the loudest voices, those who demand the spotlight. But it's the quiet ones, the ones who work in the shadows, who keep the world safe. The guests leaned closer, their silence absolute, drawn to a truth they'd long ignored. John's voice, though soft, filled the space, its sincerity a rebuke to the clamor of their earlier judgments. He shifted his gaze, distant, as if seeing beyond the chandeliered hall. "I knew a boy once," he said, his tone softening further, barely 19, who carried a rifle heavier than his dreams. He stood beside me in a jungle under a sky torn by fire, and when the bullets came, he didn't run. He fell saving a friend, his name lost to all but those who were there. The story was brief, its details spare, yet it struck with piercing clarity. The crowd felt the weight of that unnamed soldier, a life extinguished without fanfare, a sacrifice mirrored in John's own uncelebrated years. Their breaths caught the story, a mirror to their own haste to honor only what shone. John's words were not an accusation, but a reflection, a call to see what they'd missed. The guests with their polished lives had prized what could be flaunted wealth status applause, while dismissing the quiet acts that held the world together. John's life, built on duty and restraint, was a testament to a different kind of strength, one that didn't seek recognition but endured all the same. His humility, unshaken by their earlier scorn, stood as a challenge to their values, urging them to look beyond the surface. The veterans behind him, their faces carved with shared loss, nodded faintly, their bond a silent affirmation of his truth. The hall seemed to shrink, its extravagance dimmed by the power of John's voice. A woman in a velvet dress, who'd once whispered doubts, clasped her hands tightly, her eyes glistening. A young entrepreneur, quick to jest in the night's early hours, sat still, his head bowed, absorbing the lesson of a life lived for others. The story of the 19-year-old, brief as it was, lingered a reminder of countless others whose names never made the headlines. John's refusal to claim glory for himself to speak, instead of a fallen comrade, deepened the crowd's respect. Their earlier biases crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. John's gaze returned to the present, settling briefly on Michael, whose eyes shone with a mix of awe and remorse. He didn't linger there, his focus on the room, on the truth he'd carried too long. "I've seen what happens when we celebrate only what's loud," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We forget the ones who matter most." The words were a quiet indictment, not of the crowd alone, but of a world that often overlooked its truest heroes. Yet there was no bitterness in his tone, only a hope that this night might mark a change, a moment when humility outshone hubris. The microphone lowered, but John's words hung in the air, a clarion call that needed no amplification. The guests remained silent, their hearts stirred by a man who'd spoken not for himself, but for those who couldn't. The veterans stood as pillars, their presence a reminder of the cost of such truths. John stepped back, his hand brushing the envelope in his pocket, his face serene, a man at peace with his place. The crowd, transformed by his voice, felt the stirrings of a deeper connection, one that would soon find its culmination in a father and son's final embrace. The wedding hall, its grandeur softened by a tide of newfound respect, cradled a moment of raw intimacy. John Carter stood at the heart of the room, his quiet words still echoing a testament to a life of unspoken sacrifice. The crowd, their hearts stirred by his humility, watched in reverent silence as Michael the groom stood before his father, his eyes brimming with a storm of regret and love. The air felt charged, a fragile thread connecting father and son, woven from truths long buried and now laid bare. In that stillness, Michael took a faltering step, then surged forward, his arms enveloping John in a fierce, desperate embrace, as if to reclaim the years they'd lost. "I'm sorry, Dad Michael," whispered his voice, breaking the words muffled against John's shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." The confession was a wound, laid open a son's plea for absolution after years of doubt and distance, John's arms steady despite the weight of the night wrapped around Michael, his hand resting gently on his son's back. His eyes reddened with unshed tears, shone with a warmth that needed no words. "You're my greatest victory, Michael," he said, his voice low, trembling with a love that had endured every slight. The words were a balm, a father's gift to a son seeking redemption. The crowd, witnesses to this sacred exchange, stirred from their silence. A soft clap began, tentative at first, then growing into a steady rhythm, not a cheer for spectacle, but a tribute to the bond reborn before them. The sound was warm, heartfelt, a collective acknowledgement of a family mended its resonance, filling the hall with a quiet joy. The guests, their earlier prejudices undone, stood united, their applause, a tapestry of respect woven from the threads of John's truth. Emily at the head table pressed a hand to her heart, her smile trembling as she watched the father and son, their embrace a beacon of hope. Among the onlookers, a figure moved forward, his steps hesitant but resolute. It was Ethan, the hedge fund manager whose spilled wine had once marked John's humiliation. His face, now pale and earnest, bore the weight of his misjudgment. He approached John, extending a hand, his voice unsteady. "Mr. Carter," he said, faltering, "I was wrong, I'm sorry. The admission was raw." His eyes flickering with shame, a man humbled by the truth he'd failed to see. John met his gaze, his expression kind but unflinching, and clasped Ethan's hand firmly. "It's enough to know better now," he replied. His tone gentle, offering forgiveness without fanfare. Ethan nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief, and stepped back, his gesture a small but vital thread in the night's redemption. The embrace between John and Michael held a moment suspended in time, its power radiating through the room. The crowd's applause swelled, then softened, as if reluctant to intrude on the intimacy of the scene. Michael's tears, now drying, left a quiet resolve in their wake, a son reborn through the act of seeking forgiveness. John's hand lingered on Michael's shoulder, a steady anchor. His own tears, a silent testament to a love that had never wavered, even in the face of rejection. The veteran, standing sentinel, watched with quiet pride their presence, a reminder of the brotherhood that had brought this truth to light. The hall, once a crucible of division, now pulsed with unity. Guests who'd once turned away from John now leaned toward him, their faces softened by the sight of a father and son reunited. The extravagance of the night, its crystal, its silks, felt secondary, a backdrop to a moment that spoke of what truly endured. The applause, now fading, left a silence that wasn't empty, but full, rich, with the promise of understanding. John's forgiveness extended to Michael, and Ethan alike, was a lesson in grace, a call to heal wounds with compassion rather than resentment. Michael stepped back, his hand still clasped in John's, his eyes searching his father's face as if seeing him anew. The weight of his past choices. His shame, his dismissal had lifted, replaced by a clarity that would guide him forward. John's words, simple yet profound, echoed in his heart. A victory not in medals, but in the life of a son, free to forge his own path. The crowd, their hands now still felt the ripple of this truth, their own lives touched by the power of a bond restored. As the moment settled, John's gaze swept the room, a quiet acknowledgement of the night's journey. The envelope in his pocket, a gift for Michael, remained untouched for now, its purpose yet to unfold. The embrace had sealed a wound, but John's heart turned to one final act, a gesture to honor the love and memory that had carried him through. The hall waited its heir alive, with possibility ready to witness a symbol that would etch this night into eternity. The wedding hall, bathed in a warm golden glow, held a sacred hush as John Carter, his heart fortified by the night's revelations, turned to Emily, the bride. With a quiet smile, he offered his hand, inviting her to share a dance. The band began Unchained Melody, its tender, soulful notes, a heartfelt tribute to John's late wife, Ellen, whose love had been his beacon through Vietnam's darkest trials. As they glided across the polished floor, John's voice, soft yet resonant, shared a cherished memory. "Ellen wrote me every week during the war," he murmured. "Her letters were my reason to keep going." Emily's eyes glistened, tears catching the light, while the crowd fell silent, each step a poignant celebration of devotion that transcended years. A young guest, once swift to scorn, filmed the moment, posting it online with the caption, "The True Hero." In stark contrast to the night's earlier malice, the video surged across platforms, a radiant testament to John's enduring grace. The dance, serene and deeply intimate, wove a spell of loyalty, its warmth enveloping the room in reverent awe. As the melody softened to its close, John faced Michael, his son's gaze alight with love and newfound reverence. From his pocket, John drew a worn envelope, its edges softened by time, containing a handwritten letter and his weathered badge symbols of a life unspoken. "Open this when you need to find your roots," he said, his voice a solemn vow, steady as the earth beneath them. John turned, his silhouette framed by the hall's gentle light, and walked toward the exit, each step resolute yet unhurried. Outside, the Blackhawk's engines roared to life, lifting the veterans into the night sky, their departure leaving a tranquil silence that felt eternal. Months later, Michael hung a framed photo in his office. He and John united, the badge aglow with quiet pride. Below, a line from John's letter, "Real heroes seek no applause." Shared widely, the image became a beacon, its message of truth's triumph over prejudice and humility's unyielding strength resonating far beyond the wedding's fleeting glow. The night's salutes, tears and fleeting whispers dissolved, but John's legacy, woven from love, sacrifice, and forgiveness, endured, a quiet force etched deep in countless hearts. Michael's path from doubt to devotion stirred listeners, their belief in redemption, reaffirmed the story's echo, a timeless call to honor the unseen heroes among us whose silent deeds shape the world. As the echoes of John Carter's story fade, we're left with a truth that lingers, a reminder that heroes often walk among us, their courage hidden in quiet acts of love and sacrifice. From a wedding hall steeped in judgment to a moment of redemption that united strangers, John's journey from scorn to honor, from silence to celebration, speaks to the power of humility and the strength of forgiveness, his legacy sealed in a simple envelope and a father's unwavering love, challenges us to look beyond the surface to seek the stories untold. Michael's path from shame to reverence mirrors our own capacity to grow, to mend what's broken, This tale, woven with loss and triumph, asks us to honor those who carry their burdens quietly, whose victories need no applause. What story of unsung heroism have you witnessed in your own life? Share it in the comments below. And let's keep this conversation alive. If John's journey moved you, like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and stir the soul.